You know how to push his buttons, my mother whispered while I sat on the bathroom floor at 11, pressing a cold washcloth to my ribs. That was the sentence I grew up hearing. Not "are you okay?" Not "he had no right." Just "you know how to push his buttons." Like the bruises were a choice I made. For 19 years, every time my father hit me, my mother waited until he left the room and said some version of that line. And for 19 years I believed her. I believed I was the problem. The day I moved out at 19, she called and told me I was destroying the family. I said, "You watched him destroy me for 19 years and said nothing." She hung up. 4 years of near total silence followed. 4 years of building a life from scratch. Then she called again, crying, and she said something I never expected to hear from her. It wasn't an apology, it was bigger than that, and it changed everything. Before I go on, if this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with what I'm about to tell you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. My name is Chloe. I'm 23. I'm a nurse at a small community hospital in Ohio. Yes, Ohio, where recording a conversation only requires the consent of one person in the room. That legal detail is going to matter a lot later on. Now, let me take you back to the summer I turned 11. The summer I finally understood that my mother was never going to protect me. The heavy rumble of my father's Ford F-250 vibrating up the driveway was a sound I felt in my teeth before I actually heard it. Even the truck's engine sounded disciplined, tight, controlled. Every Friday morning, before anyone else on our street was awake, he washed that truck. He made sure the neighbors peeking through their blinds saw exactly what he wanted them to see. A man who took care of his things. I was sitting at the kitchen table, gripping a yellow pencil so hard my knuckles burned white. My history textbook was open, but I wasn't reading. Behind me, the kitchen sink held 3 dirty plates, a greasy frying pan, and 2 glasses. I had forgotten them, not rebelled. Forgotten. The heavy oak front door opened with a smooth, oiled click. My breath hitched, trapping itself at the top of my throat. In a house ruled by a man like Thomas Vance, you learn to track movement by sound alone, analyzing every footstep like a vital sign on a heart monitor. The heavy measured thud of his work boots on the hardwood, the jingle of his keys landing perfectly in the ceramic bowl by the door. Then came the smell, fresh pine sawdust mixing heavily with Old Spice cologne. To the town zoning board, to the Little League parents, that smell meant an honest day's work from a respected deacon. To me it was the scent of a storm touching down. "Evening, Susan," his voice drifted from the hallway. It was low, rich, and perfectly warm, the voice he used to shake hands and close commercial renovation deals. "Dinner's staying warm, Tom," my mother replied from the hallway. Her tone was carefully soft, practically humming, like a bird trying desperately not to disturb a sleeping snake. She was wearing a cardigan buttoned all the way up to her collar, despite the stifling August heat. I stared fiercely at the textbook. "Just keep walking. Go to the bedroom to change. Don't look at the kitchen." But the heavy footsteps stopped. I felt the shift in the air pressure before he even spoke. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He was standing right behind my chair. He wasn't looking at my history homework. He was looking at the stainless steel sink. In the living room, just a few feet away, my 5-year-old brother Caleb sat on the rug, stacking wooden blocks. Clack, clack. Caleb was safe. Caleb was the son, the prop for my father's perfect public image. Thomas never laid a hand on him back then. I was the older one. I was the girl who sometimes asked questions. I was the threat to his absolute authority. My father pulled the empty chair beside me out from the table. The wooden legs scraped slowly, agonizingly against the tile. It sounded like a scream. He placed his large calloused hands flat on the table, framing his own reflection in the polished wood. He didn't yell. That is what people outside our white colonial house with its perfect black shutters never understood. A monster doesn't have to scream to make you terrified. Thomas Vance didn't lose control. He used it. He leaned in close to my ear. His breath was warm, his tone so terrifyingly even that my spine locked into a block of ice. "Come here," he whispered. I stood up, my legs feeling hollow, like they belonged to someone else. I walked down the short hallway toward my bedroom. He followed right behind me, his shadow swallowing mine. We went inside. The heavy door clicked shut. I won't describe the physical violence that happened next. I'll only tell you that the silence in the rest of the house was absolute. My mother didn't drop a pan. Caleb didn't make a sound. The house simply held its breath, waiting for the master to finish his work. Half an hour later, the heavy rumble of the Ford started up again. He was leaving for an evening church board meeting. The driveway gravel crunched, fading into the distance. Only then did my bedroom door open. I was sitting on the edge of the tub in the adjoining bathroom, shivering, holding that cold washcloth to my side where 4 dark bruises were already blooming. My mother walked in. She didn't look at the bruises. Her eyes flicked strictly to my face, wide and empty. Her hands were perfectly still, clasped tightly in front of her. She sat next to me on the bathroom tiles. She smoothed a stray hair behind my ear, a gesture so gentle it made my stomach turn. I looked at her, begging silently with my eyes for just one word of real comfort. For her to grab my hand and tell me we were leaving. Instead, she sighed, whispered that terrible sentence about pushing his buttons, stood up, and went back to the kitchen to finish wiping counters that were already clean. I sat alone in the cold bathroom, listening to Caleb's blocks tumbling down in the next room. That was the night the math became clear in my head. I was 11. I had 7 more years until I was legally an adult. 7 years of surviving a man who smiled for the town and struck in the dark. Now as an ER nurse, I know exactly what to look for when a patient comes through the sliding glass doors. I look at the injury, and then I look at the story. If the story is a square peg and the injury is a round hole, an invisible alarm goes off in my head. They teach us to watch the body language. Who is doing all the talking? Who is shrinking into the paper on the exam table? But back then, I was just the girl on the table, listening to the crinkle of the sanitary paper beneath me, trying to breathe through a fractured wrist or a cracked rib. By the time I was 15, the violence in our house wasn't just a secret. It was a deeply entrenched, well-oiled machine, and the emergency room was just another stage for my father to perform on. I had been there 6 times in 4 years. The script was always exactly the same. The drive to the county hospital was always completely silent. My mother would grip the steering wheel with white knuckles, her eyes locked dead ahead on the dark, winding roads. My father would sit in the passenger seat, calm, his breathing steady and deep. I would sit in the back, holding an ice pack to whatever part of me was throbbing, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. Nobody cried. Nobody spoke. The silence was heavier than the pain. When we walked into the bright humming lights of the ER waiting room, Thomas Vance instantly transformed. His posture softened. His face melted into a mask of deep, loving concern. He would guide me to the triage desk with a heavy, warm hand resting right on the center of my back. "She's so clumsy," my mother, Susan, would tell the intake nurse, her voice fluttering with practiced nervous energy. "Always running around, never looking where she's going. Just a typical teenager, you know." She would let out a soft, airy laugh, and the nurse would usually smile back, because why wouldn't she? The man standing next to us wasn't a monster. He was Thomas Vance, the church deacon, the Little League coach, the man who smelled like fresh pine sawdust and hard work. He would shake the male doctor's hands with a firm grip and call the female nurses ma'am. He was the perfect worried father from a Hallmark movie. But the 6th visit was different. It was late November. The wind outside was rattling the hospital windows. I had a deep, dark contusion forming along my collarbone and a badly sprained left shoulder. The story they had settled on during the silent car ride was the basement stairs. I slipped in my socks. The doctor who walked into exam room 4 wasn't the usual older, tired physician. She was young, maybe early 30s. Her name tag said Dr. Eris. She had sharp, dark eyes that didn't immediately crinkle into a smile when my father turned on his charm. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," Dr. Eris said, her voice completely neutral. She didn't shake my father's extended hand. She went straight to the sink, washed her hands, and then turned to me. "Hi, Chloe. Let's take a look at that shoulder." My mother sat in the plastic chair in the corner, clutching her purse in her lap like a shield. My father stood right beside the exam table. He was standing just an inch too close. Dr. Eris gently peeled back the collar of my hospital gown. She looked at the fresh purple and yellow bruising. Then her eyes traced down my arm, taking in a faint, older yellowish bruise near my elbow from 2 weeks prior. The room grew very still. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Dr. Eris stepped back and looked at my chart. She flipped a page. Then another. I saw her eyes scanning the dates. 4 years. 6 visits. Broken fingers. Bruised ribs. Sprained joints. "The basement stairs are steep," my father said, his voice a smooth, rich baritone. He offered a sad, apologetic smile. "I keep telling her, no running in socks. Teenagers never listen, do they?" Dr. Eris didn't smile back. She didn't even look at him. She kept her sharp eyes locked entirely on me. "Chloe," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. It was quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. Is someone hurting you? My breath froze in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought the monitor would pick it up. For one split second, the heavy dark curtain of my life lifted. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Dr. Eris's white coat and beg her not to let me go back to the house with the black shutters. My eyes watered. I opened my mouth. Before a single sound could escape my lips, my father's large hand came down on my right shoulder. To the doctor it looked like a comforting, protective squeeze. But to me it was a vice. His thick fingers pressed directly into the nerve cluster near my neck. It wasn't hard enough to make me cry out, but it was just hard enough to send a sharp, terrifying bolt of electricity down my spine. It was a promise. If you speak, you will pay for it when we get home. I looked at my mother in the corner. She was staring at the floor, perfectly still. I swallowed the lump of terror in my throat. I forced my face to go blank. I looked back at Dr. Eris. I fell. I whispered, my voice sounding hollow and dead in my own ears. I'm just clumsy. My father's thumb stroked my shoulder, a sickening gesture of victory. We'll have to put a gate up at the top of those stairs. He chuckled softly. Dr. Eris stared at me for 3 long, agonizing seconds. She knew. I saw it in her eyes. She knew I was lying, and she knew exactly who the man standing next to me really was. She didn't push. She couldn't. I had given her the answer she was legally required to accept. She clicked her pen, turned to the computer and began to type. Her keystrokes were sharp and angry. I didn't know it then, but I found out years later what she was typing into my permanent medical file. Recurrent injuries inconsistent with stated mechanism of injury. Patient presents with older healing contusions. Father's hovering behavior noted. Recommend CPS follow-up. CPS never came to Elm Creek Drive. In a town where Thomas Vance bought coffee for the fire chief and built the mayor's back deck, a note in a hospital computer system was just a digital ghost. But sitting on that cold exam table at 15, feeling the heavy, terrifying weight of my father's hand on my skin, I didn't know the paper trail had officially begun. I didn't know that Dr. Eris had just quietly handed me the very weapon I would use to destroy him 8 years later. All I knew as we walked out into the freezing rain to get back into the dark truck was that I was entirely on my own. I snapped the white plastic safety cap onto the amber pill bottle. 3 tight clicks to lock it in place. In the pharmacy on Pearl Street, everything made sense. Every medicine had a clear label, a set dosage, and side effects you could predict and manage. If someone was in pain, there was a specific, measured way to fix it. It was the exact opposite of my life at home. By the time I turned 17, I had realized a cold, terrifying truth. If I didn't build my own exit, I was going to die in that house. Either my body would finally give out from a fall down the stairs, or my mind would snap. My brother Caleb was 11 now. He spent most of his time watching the room from the corners, his eyes wide, tracking our father's every move. He was starting to flinch when doors closed too fast. I had to show him that a person could actually leave. I had forged my father's signature on a school work permit, telling the counselor I was saving for a college laptop. I started working 4 afternoons a week, 16 hours, $11.50 an hour. It wasn't just money. It was oxygen. My father found out on a Tuesday. We were sitting at the dinner table. The only sound was the clinking of silverware against porcelain. My father was cutting a piece of roast beef. He sliced it slowly, perfectly, the serrated edge of his knife scraping the plate with a sharp screech. Frank from the zoning board came up to me today, my father said. He didn't look up from his plate. His voice was light, almost conversational. Said he picked up his blood pressure medicine at the Pearl Street pharmacy. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Caleb froze, his eyes darting from his plate to me. Said my daughter handed it to him. My father continued. He set his knife down. He finally looked at me, his eyes completely dead behind a polite smile. Is that right, Chloe? Yes, sir, I said, keeping my voice as flat as possible. Just a few hours after school. The silence stretched. It pulled tight like a rubber band about to snap. He reached for his water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down exactly on the watermark it had left. No daughter of mine needs to work, he said. The warmth was gone from his tone. It was a command wrapped in a casual observation. People like Frank will think I can't provide for my own family. They'll think I'm failing. It's just for college savings. I lied smoothly. It shows initiative. It makes you look like a father who teaches a strong work ethic. That stopped him. He tilted his head, calculating the public relations value of my excuse. A hard-working daughter made the Vance family look even better. He picked up his knife again, See that it doesn't interfere with your chores," he muttered. I kept the job. Every Friday I cashed my check and hid the money in a dusty shoebox tucked behind a stack of AP biology textbooks under my bed. Every night I locked my bedroom door and did the math. After taxes, I was bringing home about $150 a week. For 8 months, I watched that stack of $20 bills grow. 3,000. 3,500. Finally, I hit 4,200. It was my ransom money. It was enough for a security deposit, first and last month's rent on a cheap apartment, a used car, and groceries. I could almost taste the freedom. I could almost feel the quiet of a room where no one was coming to hurt me. Then, my mother saw the box. I had come home from a late shift and pulled it out to add my newest bills. I didn't hear her open my door. When I turned around, Susan was standing in the doorway, staring at the thick wads of cash on my bed. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Her breath hitched. She stared at the money, and then she looked up at my face. I braced myself for her to yell, to run and tell him, but she didn't. Her expression shifted into something I couldn't fully read. It was fear, yes, but beneath the fear was a sudden sharp envy. For a few seconds she wasn't Susan Vance, the obedient wife. She was a woman remembering who she used to be at 23, before she let Thomas lock her in a cage of casseroles and cardigans. She was looking at a girl who had built her own door. She closed her eyes, shook her head once, and backed out of the room without saying a single word. She closed the door softly behind her. I should have moved the money that night. My nursing instincts now tell me to always act on a warning sign. But I was tired. I thought I was safe. 2 days later, I came home from school. My father's truck was in the driveway, 2 hours earlier than usual. I walked into the kitchen. He was sitting at the head of the dining table. The shoebox was open in front of him. My heart crashed into my stomach. I stopped in the doorway, my backpack sliding off my shoulder to hit the floor with a heavy thud. He didn't scream. He didn't throw anything. He simply looked at me, his face a terrifying blank wall. He reached into the box and pulled out a stack of 20s. With agonizing slowness, he began to count them. Snap, snap. The sound of the crisp bills flipping onto the wood echoed through the completely silent house. My mother was standing by the sink, her back to us, scrubbing a dish. She never turned around. She had told him. He counted every single dollar. It took 3 full minutes. 3 minutes of me standing frozen, watching my freedom, my safety, my very life, being neatly stacked into a pile. When he finished, he folded the thick stack of bills in half and slid them into his heavy leather wallet. "Money earned under my roof," he said, his voice a low vibrating hum that rattled my bones, "belongs to this household. You owe me for room and board." He stood up, pushed his chair in, and walked past me. His shoulder brushed mine. I lost $4,200 in 3 minutes. I didn't cry. Crying was a weakness he fed on. I walked to my room, locked the door, and lay on my back, staring at the blank white ceiling. The fear I had lived with for 17 years didn't vanish, but it froze solid. It turned into a cold, unbreakable spike of pure resolve in my chest. He thought he had trapped me. He thought taking the money would break my spirit. He was wrong. The very next afternoon, I went back to the pharmacy. I started a new stack of bills, and this time I hid the cash deep inside a box of tampons in the back of the bathroom cabinet. It was the one place in the house a man like Thomas Vance would never ever touch. And I started counting the days again. By the time I turned 19, I had mastered the art of being invisible. In my father's house, survival meant shrinking your footprint until you barely cast a shadow. I had rebuilt my ransom money, $20 at a time, shoved deep inside that cardboard tampon box in the back of the bathroom cabinet. It was enough for a deposit and first month's rent on a tiny ground-floor studio apartment 3 towns over, far enough that Thomas Vance wouldn't casually drive past it. I had also quietly applied to the nursing program at the community college, using a public computer at the county library. To protect my escape, I rented a P.O. box at the post office for $14 a month. Every piece of mail, every acceptance letter, every financial document went there. It was a flawless system, but mail is a fragile thing, and human error is a variable you can't always control. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The college financial aid office had run an automated system update, and my secondary address, my physical address, had accidentally triggered a duplicate mailing of my financial aid summary. I didn't know it was coming, but Thomas Vance checked the mailbox at 4:30 p.m. sharp, every single day. Dinner that night felt heavier than usual. The dining room air was thick, suffocating in its stillness. My mother had spent an hour making roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the steam rising in lazy twisting curls toward the chandelier. Caleb, now 13, sat directly across from me. He was small for his age, drowning in an oversized gray sweater, his eyes glued to his plate. He had learned the same survival tactics I had. Don't speak, don't look up, don't exist. I sat down. I reached for my napkin. That was when I saw it. Resting perfectly parallel to the salt shaker, right next to my father's water glass, was a crisp white envelope. The community college logo was printed in the top left corner. My stomach dropped so fast I felt physically dizzy. In the ER, when a trauma patient's blood pressure bottoms out, the monitors emit a steady, urgent tone. My pulse was doing that right now, pounding in my ears. My father took his seat. He picked up his fork. He took a bite of chicken, chewed slowly, and swallowed. He wiped his mouth with his napkin. He was drawing it out. He loved the theater of it. "What's this?" he asked. His voice was conversational, almost curious. He didn't look at the envelope. He looked right at me. His eyes were dark, flat, and completely devoid of warmth. I looked at the envelope. My throat closed up. "It's mine," I managed to say. My voice trembled just a fraction, a weakness I instantly regretted showing. "Yours." He rolled the word around in his mouth like he was tasting it. He picked up the envelope. He didn't tear it open wildly. He slid his thick thumbnail carefully under the flap, peeling it back with agonizing slowness. "Rolv." The sound echoed off the dining room walls. He pulled out the summary. He unfolded the thick paper. I watched his eyes track back and forth across the page, taking his time to absorb the numbers, the grants, the implications of what this piece of paper actually meant. A daughter slipping the leash. He set the paper down flat on the table. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood. He wasn't angry yet. He was dangerously calm. "You think you're leaving?" he asked softly. It wasn't a question, it was a threat. "Nobody in this family makes a decision without going through me," he whispered, leaning an inch closer. "You belong in this house until I say you don't." He picked up the letter in both hands. Slowly, deliberately, he tore it straight down the middle. One clean rip. Then he put the pieces together and tore them again. Rip. 4 pieces of paper. He laid them neatly beside his plate, exactly like a place setting. I looked at my mother. She was cutting her meat, the silver knife scraping the ceramic plate. Her hands were trembling. The shaking was so slight, so violently suppressed, that you would miss it if you weren't looking. But I saw it. She wouldn't look up. Caleb gripped his fork, his knuckles white, holding his breath. Nobody spoke for the rest of the meal. The silence was absolute, heavy and terrifying. 2 hours later, the house was pitch black. I lay in my bed, fully dressed, listening to the silence. I waited until I heard the heavy rhythmic snoring of my father coming from down the hall. I pulled my heavy comforter entirely over my head to muffle the sound. I reached under my mattress, pulled out my prepaid cell phone, and dialed the admissions office. The glowing numbers on the screen read 10:14 p.m. I had to leave a voicemail. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone twice. The next morning, I called them back from the school parking lot. "I need a replacement copy," I whispered into the phone, scanning the parking lot for my father's truck, my chest tight with panic. The original was damaged. The woman on the other end paused. Through the static of the line, she heard the sheer terror vibrating in my voice. She didn't ask questions. She didn't press for details. "We'll send a new one to whatever address you'd like, sweetheart," she said gently. The kindness in her voice almost broke me. It was so foreign, so warm. I gave her the P.O. box number. I hung up the phone and rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel of my friend Sarah's car. My 19th birthday was exactly 3 days away. I knew if I stayed one more week, the psychological cage he was building around me would become a physical one. He would find the new money. He would trap me forever. I had to leave, and I had to do it while he was gone. In the emergency room, when a trauma patient is bleeding out internally, we talk about the golden hour. You have exactly 60 minutes to stop the bleeding before the organs start shutting down. Your body goes into survival mode, cutting off everything else just to keep the heart pumping. My golden hour started at 2:15 p.m. on my 19th birthday. I had checked my father's heavy leather-bound schedule book the night before while he was asleep. He was running a commercial renovation 50 miles away. He wouldn't be back until exactly 7 p.m. I had 4 hours and 45 minutes to disappear. But fear doesn't care about math. Every settling groan of the house sounded like his heavy work boots on the front porch. Every shadow stretching across the hardwood floor looked like him. Outside, the November air was freezing. My friend Sarah's beat-up Honda Civic was idling at the curb, its exhaust puffing thick gray smoke into the cold. I had 2 suitcases and a school backpack. That was it. 19 years of my life, zipped up in cheap canvas. I picked up the first suitcase. The handle dug into my palm. I walked down the stairs, stepping carefully on the extreme edges of the wooden steps so they wouldn't squeak. My heart was slamming against my ribs so fast it made me dizzy. Just keep breathing. Just get to the door. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked toward the kitchen. My mother was standing at the sink. Her back was to me. The water was running full blast. I stood there for a moment watching her. She was washing a white ceramic plate, round and round. The sponge moved in slow, mechanical circles. She had been washing that exact same plate for 10 minutes. The soap bubbles were completely gone. The plate was clean. "Mom," I whispered. My voice felt like crushed glass in my throat. She didn't stop scrubbing. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders locked tight, rigid under her neat floral blouse. "If you leave," she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was thin, breathless, and reedy, like a bird trapped inside a wall. "Who's going to help me with dinner?" The question hung in the air, mixing with the sound of the running water. I stared at her shaking hands, and suddenly, the truth hit me with a sickening heavy weight. It wasn't about the dinner. It was never about the dinner. "Please don't go," she was saying. But she wasn't saying it out of love. She was saying it out of pure selfish terror. If I was in the house, I was the lightning rod. I absorbed the shocks. I took the bruises. If I left, the lightning would have no place to strike but on her. Or worse, on Caleb. A wave of profound pity washed over me, immediately followed by a sharp cold wave of grief. I loved her, but I couldn't save her. Not if it meant drowning with her. I set the suitcase softly by the front door and walked down the short hallway to Caleb's room. He was sitting on the very edge of his bed. He was 13 years old, but he looked so small, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He was staring at the floor, biting his lower lip until it was completely white, trying desperately not to cry. I dropped to my knees on the carpet in front of him. I reached out and took both of his hands. They were ice cold, freezing, like a patient going into severe shock. "Look at me," I whispered. He shook his head, squeezing his eyes shut as a single tear escaped and tracked down his cheek. "Caleb, please, look at me." He slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide, filled with a panic that mirrored my own. "I'm going to come back for you," I said. I poured every ounce of certainty, every bit of my clinical calm into my voice so he would believe me. "I promise you. I just need to get strong enough to fight him. Just keep your head down until I can figure this out. Do exactly what he says. Don't push back. Just survive." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't beg. Even at 13, my little brother understood the math of our house. He knew that asking me to stay meant asking me to let our father break me forever. I hugged him so hard my ribs ached, memorizing the scent of his boyish laundry detergent. Then, I let go. I stood up, picked up my bags and walked to the heavy oak front door. The house was dead quiet, except for the rushing water in the kitchen sink. My mother still hadn't turned around. I pushed the door open, stepped out into the freezing air, and didn't look back until I had thrown my bags into Sarah's back seat and climbed into the passenger side. "Go," I told Sarah. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Just drive." As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the house on Elm Creek Drive, the perfect lawn, the seasonal wreath on the door. And then, I saw movement. In the living room window, standing just behind the sheer white curtain, was my mother. She had one hand pressed flat against the cold glass. For one single breathless second, she pulled the curtain back. I saw her face clearly. It was a mask of absolute silent devastation. She was watching her shield drive away. Then her hand dropped. The curtain fell back into place. The house swallowed her whole. That was the beginning of the lost years. In nursing, we learn about something called phantom limb syndrome. A patient loses an arm or a leg in a violent accident, but for months afterward their brain still sends signals to the missing limb. They feel a sharp itch in a hand that isn't there. They feel a burning ache in a knee that was amputated. The body remembers the trauma, long after the source of it is gone. That was what my first few weeks in the new studio apartment felt like. A phantom trauma. The apartment was tiny. I had a mattress directly on the scratched hardwood floor, a single wobbly lamp I had bought from Goodwill for $4, and a set of thin gray curtains from the Target clearance rack. The walls were bare. The refrigerator hummed with a rattling, uneven, mechanical cough. But the most overwhelming part of that apartment was the silence. It was a deafening, heavy quiet. Every night I lay rigid on my mattress in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. My muscles were locked tight, waiting. My brain was still living on Elm Creek Drive. When the wind rattled the cheap window frame, my breath caught, expecting the heavy thud of my father's work boots on the stairs. When a car drove past outside, the sweep of its headlights across my wall made me freeze, waiting for the bedroom door to open. I was physically safe, but my nervous system hadn't gotten the message. Then on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after I left, my cheap prepaid phone lit up on the floor next to my mattress. It buzzed against the wood, a harsh, violent sound that made me jump. I looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID said Susan Vance. For one brief, foolish second, the little girl inside me flared to life. She's calling to see if I'm okay. She's calling to tell me she left him too. My hand was shaking as I picked it up and pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered. "Chloe." My mother's voice wasn't warm. It was tight, brittle, and frantic. I could hear the panicked, shallow rhythm of her breathing. In the background I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the heavy rhythmic pacing of footsteps on hardwood. He was in the room with her, or right outside it. "Mom? Are you okay?" "Your father isn't eating," she said abruptly. The words tumbled out of her like she was reading from a script he had written. "He's not sleeping. The house feels wrong without you here. He's so upset." I closed my eyes. The cold reality washed over me, chilling me to the bone. She wasn't calling to check on me. She was calling because, without me there to absorb his anger, the temperature in the house was rising, and she was starting to feel the heat. "I'm not coming back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, trying to keep it steady. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The fear in her voice instantly hardened into something bitter and sharp. "You are destroying this family, Chloe," she hissed. The accusation was venomous. "Do you know what people at the church are saying? Do you know how hard this is for us?" I sat up on my mattress. The darkness in the room felt different now. The phantom pain was gone, replaced by a deep, agonizing clarity. I was a nurse now. I knew how to triage a wound, and right then I knew I had to cauterize this relationship to survive. "You watched him destroy me for 19 years, I said. My voice was no longer a whisper. It was cold, precise and flat. "You stood at the sink and washed clean dishes while he left bruises on my ribs. Do not ever call me to say I am the one breaking things." I didn't wait for her to respond. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. The line went dead. I didn't hear her voice again for 4 years. Those 4 years were the hardest, most grueling years of my life. I became a ghost. I changed my number. I worked double shifts at a damp, underfunded nursing home on Highway 47, cleaning bedpans and turning elderly patients while studying anatomy flashcards in the break room. I learned how to exist in the real world. I learned how to fix a leaky sink with a wrench, and YouTube videos. I learned how to pay an electric bill. I also went to therapy, a free clinic 2 towns over. It took me a year just to sit in the chair without staring at the door. My therapist gave my habits a medical name. Hypervigilance, PTSD. The way I mapped every exit the second I walked into a grocery store. The way a doctor dropping a metal clipboard at the hospital made my heart rate spike to 130 beats per minute. I was healing. Slowly. The bruises faded. The night terrors stopped coming every night. But the guilt of leaving Caleb behind was a chronic illness. It ate at me every single day. He was 14, then 15, then 16. I tried to send letters to his high school, but they were returned. I found out later that Thomas had confiscated Caleb's phone and gone to the principal, threatening to pull Caleb out of the district if I was allowed to contact him. I was completely erased. One evening when I was 22, I had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift. I was sitting on my second-hand couch, eating cold soup from a can, scrolling numbly through Facebook. A suggested post popped up. It was the public page for Hope Fellowship Church. It was a photograph of my father. He was grinning wide, his teeth perfectly white, looking handsome and solid in his navy suit. He had one arm slung proudly around Pastor Michael. They were standing in front of a large glossy banner. 2026 Man of the Year nominee, Thomas Vance. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. I scrolled down. Right below the photo was a comment from Susan's account. "So proud of this man and the beautiful family we've built. God is so good." I clicked on the photo to expand it. That was when I noticed the edges. The framing was slightly off. My mother and Caleb were standing on the other side of my father, but on the far right edge there was a tiny floating sliver of a floral dress. My dress from a church picnic 5 years ago. The family in that photo was 3 people. They had quite literally cropped me out of the picture. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone. I just stared at the smiling face of the man who had terrified me for 2 decades. The man who was now being celebrated as a pillar of the community. I closed the app. I put my soup can in the sink, washed it, and dried it. I turned off the single lamp in my apartment, and I lay down in the quiet dark. I knew with absolute certainty that the story wasn't over. A man like Thomas Vance doesn't just stop breaking things. If he didn't have me, he would eventually find something else to break. I just didn't know the call was going to come a year later. I was 23. Caleb was 17, a senior in high school. I hadn't seen his face in 4 years. I only knew what he looked like from the few blurry photos the high school posted on their public sports page. It was a freezing Tuesday in early November. Outside my apartment window, the wind was howling, rattling the thin glass panes. Inside, it was completely quiet. I was sitting on my bed in the dark, my nursing scrubs folded in a neat pile on the chair, listening to the steady, comforting hum of the refrigerator. At exactly 10:14 p.m., my phone lit up on the nightstand. The harsh blue glow cut through the darkness, casting long shadows against the wall. The phone vibrated violently against the cheap wood. Buzz, buzz. I rolled over and looked at the screen. The caller ID said Susan Vance. My heart instantly skipped a beat. In the ER, when a heart monitor skips like that, it's called an arrhythmia. It means the electrical signals in your chest are misfiring. For 10 agonizing seconds, I stared at the name. I almost didn't answer. I reached out to press the red button to send her back into the silence she had chosen, but a nurse is trained to listen for emergencies, and something deep inside my gut told me this wasn't a trap. I picked up the phone. I pressed it to my ear. I didn't say a word. For a long time there was only the sound of breathing on the other end. But it wasn't normal breathing. It was ragged, shallow, and wet. I had never heard my mother cry like this. Not the delicate, quiet sniffling she used when my father was annoyed. This was a raw, uncontrolled, animalistic sobbing. It was the terrifying sound of a container that had been sealed tight for 3 decades suddenly shattering into a million pieces. Chloe, her voice cracked, breaking on the 2 syllables of my name. She gasped for air, a sharp, desperate sound. Chloe, please, please don't hang up. I sat up straight. I pressed my palm flat against my mattress, anchoring myself to the present, fighting the sudden urge to scan my empty apartment for my father. I'm here, I said, my voice slipping automatically into the low, steady tone I used for trauma patients. I'm listening. Tell me what happened. Another ragged sob tore through the phone. I heard a door click shut in the background. She was hiding. He started hitting Caleb. The room tilted. The solid floor beneath my bed felt like it was turning into liquid. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My brother, the golden sun, the prop. When? I asked. My voice was deadly quiet. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like a stranger. It started a year after you left, she choked out, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. Slowly at first. The way he used to do with you when you were little. Shoving him against the wall, grabbing his arms. But tonight, oh God, Chloe, tonight. She couldn't finish the sentence. She was hyperventilating. I could picture her perfectly, hiding in the master bathroom, the lights off, her hand clamped over her mouth to muffle the sound. Breathe, I commanded firmly. Tell me what he did tonight. Caleb talked back. She whispered, her voice trembling so badly the phone rattled against her ear. He just wanted to go to a college fair with his friends this weekend. Your father said no. Caleb asked why. And Tom, she let out a long, broken wail. He hit him, Chloe. He hit him with a closed fist. Hard. Like he used to hit you. She finally said it. She finally admitted it out loud. The phantom monster in our house suddenly had a name, and my mother was finally pointing right at him. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and then, she said the sentence I had replayed 1,000 times in my darkest, angriest fantasies. The sentence I had completely given up on ever hearing from Susan Vance. Chloe, she cried, her voice dropping to a desperate, broken whisper. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. About the dishes. About you pushing his buttons. About all of it. You were just a little girl, and I am so sorry. I sat perfectly still on the edge of my mattress in the dark. I didn't feel a sudden rush of forgiveness. I wasn't there yet. I didn't feel relief either. It was something much more complicated and heavy. It was the profound, earth-shattering feeling of absolute validation. I hadn't been crazy. I hadn't deserved it. I was a victim, and the only witness to my childhood had finally taken the stand. I closed my eyes. The 19-year-old girl who had run out the front door finally stopped running. "Where is Caleb right now?" I asked, my brain rapidly shifting gears. "In his room. The door is locked. Tom is in the garage." "Mom, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice turning to cold steel. "Did you stop him?" "I couldn't," she sobbed. I froze. "But I did something else." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I had my phone in my apron pocket. I pressed record before I walked into the kitchen. I recorded what he did. I recorded everything he said." My eyes snapped open. The dark room suddenly felt electrified. In the state of Ohio, the law is very clear. We are a one-party consent state. That means as long as one person involved in the conversation, or simply present in the room where it is happening, consents to the recording, it is 100% legal. It is admissible in court. It is undeniable proof. "Send me the file," I said. "Send it to me right now. And the second it says delivered, do not delete it from your phone. Do you understand?" "Yes," she whispered. "I'm sending it." She hung up. At exactly 10:47 p.m., my phone buzzed again. A text message from Susan. An audio file attached. The file was 5 minutes and 14 seconds long. I sat alone in the dark, shivering in my thin t-shirt, and I pressed play. I listened to it once. Only once. It made me physically sick to my stomach. It brought the smell of pine sawdust and Old Spice rushing back into my nose. It made my old bruises ache with phantom pain. But as the recording ended, and the silence returned to my safe, quiet apartment, my fear was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, clinical focus. Thomas Vance had built his entire life on controlling the narrative. He was the respected deacon, the loving father, the man of the year. But sitting on my mattress, staring at the glowing audio file on my screen, I realized something. Thomas had finally made a fatal mistake. He had given me a weapon, and I knew exactly how to use it. In the medical field, there is a concept called anchoring bias. It means that whatever the first doctor writes in a patient's chart heavily influences how every other doctor sees that patient. If the first note says patient is anxious and exaggerating, the next doctor won't look for a real disease. They will only see anxiety. The first person to tell the story wins. By the next morning, my father was already rewriting my chart. I called a legal aid office 3 counties over, far enough away that the name Thomas Vance wouldn't make the receptionist sit up straight. I sat at my small kitchen table, tracing the wood grain with my fingernail, and laid out the facts to an attorney named Karen. I told her about the recording. I told her about Caleb. Karen's voice was gentle, but the words she spoke were heavy with a cold, hard reality. "Chloe, you have a solid piece of evidence," she said, the sound of her typing clicking softly through the phone. "But since Caleb is 17, he is legally still a minor. Your father has absolute, unchecked control over his finances, his housing, and his custody. But more dangerously, your father has a head start on the narrative. In a small town, narrative is everything." She was exactly right. While I was sitting in my quiet apartment researching state laws, Thomas was doing what Thomas did best, managing his audience. That afternoon during my lunch break at the hospital, I was sitting in the staff room staring at a cold cup of coffee when my phone rang. The screen displayed a number I hadn't seen in 4 years. The main office line for Hope Fellowship Church. I answered it, keeping my breathing perfectly even. "Hello, Chloe. It is so good to hear your voice." It was Pastor Michael. His tone was dripping with that thick, practiced pastoral concern, the kind of voice used at funerals and hospital bedsides. But underneath the warmth there was a sharp edge of condescension. "Pastor Michael," I said flatly. "Your father came to see me this morning." He sighed softly, a perfectly timed sound of sorrow. "He's heartbroken, Chloe. He told me you've been going through a very hard time lately, that you're struggling with some mental instability, paranoia." The break room suddenly felt freezing. The anchoring bias. Thomas was planting the seeds. Chloe is troubled. Chloe is crazy. Chloe wants to tear apart a God-fearing family out of spite. Is there anything the church can do to help you get the psychiatric care you need? Pastor Michael asked. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. My father wasn't just building a defense. He was building a prison for my reputation. If I came forward now, the town would just shake their heads and say, "Poor Thomas. dealing with such a sick daughter. I'm perfectly fine, Pastor, I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. Thank you for the call. I hung up and dropped the phone onto the table. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as a crazy girl's rant. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed again. It was an unknown number. I answered it in the dark. Hello, Chloe? The whisper was so faint, so terrified, that for a second I didn't recognize it. It was Caleb. He was calling from a cheap burner phone he had borrowed from a kid in his chemistry class. Caleb, I breathed, sitting straight up in bed. Are you okay? Where is he? He's asleep, Caleb whispered. I could hear a floorboard groan on his end of the line. He was hiding in his closet. His breath was catching in his throat, tight and panicked. Chloe, I don't know what to do. Talk to me, I said, dropping into my clinical trauma voice. Give me the facts. What happened today? He sat me down at the kitchen table, Caleb said, his voice shaking violently. He didn't yell. You know how he gets when he doesn't yell. I closed my eyes. I knew exactly how he got. He was completely calm, Caleb continued, the tears finally spilling over into his words. He brought out the bank statements, my college fund, the savings account they've been building since I was born. There's $42,000 in it, Chloe. I need that money for engineering school. My stomach turned to lead. Because Caleb was a minor, that account was legally in Thomas's name. It was his money to do whatever he wanted with. It was the ultimate leash. What did he say, Caleb? He said, you want this money for college. You do exactly what I say. No contact with your sister. You don't tell anyone what happens inside this house. And you come to the Man of the Year ceremony next Friday. You wear the suit I bought you. And you smile for the cameras. Caleb let out a broken, hopeless sob. He's going to trap me here forever, Chloe. Just like he trapped Mom. The cheapest, most effective prison is the one a monster builds out of your own hope. Thomas was forcing Caleb to choose between his safety and his future. Listen to me, I said fiercely, cutting through his panic. Do not agree. Do not refuse. You just nod. Keep your head down and wait. Can you do that for me? Wait for what? He cried softly. Just wait. After I hung up, I turned on the single lamp on my desk. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, but my mind was perfectly clear. I wrote down 2 things. Or records, my legal right to request them under HIPAA. Susan's audio recording, legal in Ohio. I had the weapons, but a weapon is useless if you fire it in the dark. I needed an audience. I needed a stage. 3 days later, Thomas Vance handed me one. He called me on a Thursday afternoon. I stared at his name on the caller ID for 5 full rings before I pressed answer. Chloe, sweetheart, he said. His voice was a masterpiece of manipulation. It was warm, relaxed, and deeply affectionate. It was the exact voice he used at church barbecues while flipping burgers for the town council. Dad, I said quietly, playing the part of the exhausted, defeated daughter. I know we've had our differences, he said smoothly, the magnanimous father extending an olive branch. But I want to put all that behind us. The church is hosting the Man of the Year dinner next Friday night. 250 people are going to be there. The mayor, the zoning board, everyone. He paused, letting the weight of his importance settle over the line. I want our family up on that stage together, he said. All 4 of us. I want to show everybody that the Vances are solid, that we stick together through hard times. I saw the trap instantly. He needed the visual. He needed the town to see me standing next to him, smiling. If I came back willingly, it proved that the rumors about my instability were just a phase, and that he was the loving, forgiving father. It would close the book on any questions people might have. He was offering me the very stage I needed. I took a slow, deep breath. I channeled every ounce of fear I had ever felt in that house, and I buried it under a layer of pure, clinical ice. Okay, I said, letting my voice sound small and compliant. I'll be there, Dad. I could hear the smile spreading across his face. He exhaled, a long, victorious breath. The master manipulator had pulled the final string. That's my girl, he chuckled. I'll see you Friday. He hung up the phone. He thought he had just won the war. He didn't know I was bringing my own script. In medicine, there is a strict rule about infections. If you want to cure a deep, festering wound, you cannot just cover it with a clean bandage. You have to cut it open. You have to expose the rot to the bright, sterile lights of the operating room, scrape out the poison, and let the air hit it. It is an ugly, painful process. But it is the only way a body can survive. On Thursday morning, I walked into the county hospital to get my scalpel. The medical records department was in the basement. It didn't smell like bleach and iodine like the floors where I worked. It smelled like dust, old printer ink, and buried secrets. Under the HIPAA privacy law, every patient has the absolute legal right to request their own medical files. You don't need a lawyer. You don't need a court order. You just need an ID. The woman behind the thick plexiglass window had a name tag that read Nancy. She took my driver's license, typed my name into her clunky keyboard, and hit enter. Then she stopped typing. She took off her reading glasses. The blue light from the monitor reflected in her eyes as she looked up, her gaze shifting from the screen to my face. "I remember this name," she said quietly. The background noise of the hospital seemed to fade away. 6 ER visits before you turned 17. We used to whisper about it at the nurses' station. I always wondered what happened to you. I stood tall. I didn't shrink. I didn't look at the floor. "I survived," I told her, my voice perfectly level, "and now I need the paper trail." She didn't ask another question. She expedited the printing. 10 minutes later, she slid a thick, heavy manila envelope under the glass slot. It held 6 different medical reports. 4 of them contained the exact same lethal notation: injuries inconsistent with accidental mechanism. And there, on the report from Dr. Aris, was the golden sentence: recommend CPS follow-up. Paper has a long, unforgiving memory. Even when an entire town chooses to forget, the ink remembers. That night, back in my dark apartment, I picked up my phone and called my mother. "I'm going to the dinner tomorrow night," I said. My voice wasn't angry. It was just exhausted and resolute. "I have my medical records, and I have the audio recording you sent me." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Chloe, no. He will destroy you. He will ruin your nursing license. He knows the mayor. He knows the police chief." "I don't care who he knows," I interrupted, my tone slicing through her panic. "I am cutting this open. But Mom, I am not asking you to speak. I know how terrified you are. I'm just asking you to stand. When I tell the truth to 250 people, we have to start by telling it to each other. Don't leave me alone up there." She started to cry, soft, helpless tears. "I'll try," she whispered. Friday night. The fellowship hall at Hope Fellowship Church was massive, packed with round tables covered in crisp white tablecloths. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of cheap lemon furniture polish, roasted chicken, and sweet carnations. 250 people filled the room. Deacons, local politicians, business owners. It was Thomas Vance's kingdom. I walked through the double doors at exactly 6:45 p.m. I didn't wear a fancy dress. I wore a plain white button-up shirt and black slacks. No makeup. My hair was pulled back tightly. I looked exactly like what I was, a 23-year-old trauma nurse holding a manila envelope, walking into an emergency. My father spotted me from across the room. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, his gold cufflinks catching the bright overhead lights. He looked powerful, untouchable. His face lit up with a massive, brilliant smile for his audience. "There she is," he boomed, his voice carrying over the chatter. "My daughter's here." He walked over and pulled me into a tight, suffocating hug. The smell of Old Spice and pine sawdust flooded my senses, triggering a phantom ache in my ribs. I didn't hug him back. I didn't pull away either. I just let my body go completely rigid, like a piece of wood. At 8 p.m., the plates were cleared, and Pastor Michael tapped the microphone. The room quieted down. He gave a glowing 10-minute speech about faith, hard work, and family. Before introducing the Man of the Year, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation. My father walked up the steps to the stage, his shoulders square, completely owning the room. He gave a humble wave, adjusted the microphone, and spoke about his blessings. And then, right on his cue, he looked down at our table. "Chloe," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "Come on up here, sweetheart. Stand with your old man." The crowd clapped affectionately. I picked up my heavy bag and walked up the 3 wooden steps to the stage. Thomas beamed. As I stepped next to the podium, he reached out and put his large, heavy arm securely around my shoulder, squeezing the nerve by my neck, just like he had in the emergency room all those years ago. It was a silent warning. "Smile. Play your part." I turned my head. I looked at his hand resting on my shirt. Then very slowly, I reached up, gripped his wrist, lifted his heavy arm off my body, and dropped it back to his side. The room went dead quiet. 250 people suddenly stopped breathing. The shift in the atmosphere was violent. For the first time in my entire life, I looked into Thomas Vance's dark eyes and saw absolute freezing fear. The mask was slipping. I stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you, Pastor Michael," I said. My voice echoed loudly off the high ceiling. It was steady. It didn't shake once. "My father told you all that I've been going through a hard time lately. He's right. I have. But not for the reasons he told you." Thomas leaned in, his smile frozen on his face, and whispered fiercely through his teeth. "Chloe, that is enough. Step down." I sidestepped him, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd. Before I turned 17, I was admitted to the county emergency room 6 different times. Every single time, my parents told the doctors that I had fallen down the stairs or tripped, but medical staff are trained to look past the story. I unzipped my bag. I pulled out the manila envelope and fanned the 6 hospital-stamped papers across the wooden podium. "These are my official medical records," I said, pointing at the papers. "They describe, and I am quoting the doctors directly, recurrent injuries inconsistent with stated mechanism. On one visit, the attending physician officially recommended Child Protective Services." Total silence. Not a single chair creaked. Thomas's face drained of blood, turning a sickly chalky white. The powerful contractor suddenly looked like a cornered animal. "She's lying," Thomas barked, panic finally bleeding loudly into his voice, breaking his perfect baritone. He grabbed the edge of the podium. "She's unstable. I told you all she was sick. You can read the files yourselves." I fired back, my voice rising over his. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone and a small powerful Bluetooth speaker. "But if you don't believe the paper, there is one more thing." I synced the speaker. I pressed play. The sound filled the massive hall, bouncing off the walls. My father's real voice. The voice from the dark. "You talk back to me one more time." Smack. The sharp, sickening sound of a closed fist hitting flesh. Then Caleb, crying out in pain, gasping for air. "Sit down. Shut up. In this house, what I say goes. You belong to me." The audio played for 5 minutes and 14 seconds. Every cruel insult, every terrifying threat, every sound of my brother weeping, reached every single table in the room. It was undeniable. It was a monster, caught on tape. Halfway through the recording, a deacon in the front row stood up, his face red with disgust, and walked out the double doors. 2 more people followed him. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt. "This was recorded by my mother, in our home last month," I said, my voice cutting through the shock. "Under state law, it is entirely legal." Thomas gripped the podium so hard the wood cracked. "That's private," he roared, his face twisting into an ugly, hateful sneer. "That is my family. You have no right." "It stopped being private the minute it left bruises," I answered, staring right through him. Suddenly, from the back of the room, a chair scraped loudly against the tile floor. My grandmother, Maggie, 74 years old, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. She stood up. Her voice was shaky, but her eyes were like flint. "My name is Margaret Hughes," she said, projecting her voice across the room. 17 years ago, I saw hand-shaped bruises on my granddaughter's ribs. I called CPS myself. Nobody followed up, because Thomas Vance knows everybody in this town. You all shook his hand. You all took his donations. Now you know." She sat down heavily. The room began to murmur, a low, horrified buzzing. But before Thomas could shout again, another chair pushed back. It was Caleb, my 17-year-old brother, trapped in the expensive suit his abuser had bought him, stood up at the front table. His hands were trembling so badly he had to grip the back of his chair, but his chin was raised. "I'm Caleb," he said, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. "I'm 17, and my dad hits me. My sister is telling the truth." Thomas let out a sound like a wounded bear, taking a step toward the edge of the stage, his fists clenched. And then, the final miracle happened. Susan Vance stood up. My mother, the woman who had spent 29 years making herself completely invisible, the woman who had washed clean plates while I bled, pushed her chair back in the 4th row. She looked up at the stage. She looked at the man she had feared her entire adult life. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and she said 6 words that brought the entire kingdom crashing down. I was silent too long. "She's right." She covered her face with her hands and burst into loud, racking sobs. 3 generations of a broken family, finally standing together, pointing directly at the monster in the light. Pastor Michael finally stepped forward. He looked physically sick, his face gray beneath the bright stage lights. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at the man he had just nominated for Man of the Year. "Thomas, the pastor said. His voice was no longer warm. It was cold and hollow. "I need to speak with the deacon board. Right now." The microphone gave a sharp, high-pitched squeal of feedback. My father stood completely alone on the stage. For decades, Thomas Vance had controlled every room he walked into. He had directed every scene. But as the crowd began to murmur, then whisper, then stand up and turn their backs to him, I saw the exact moment his world collapsed. His audience was walking out. Someone in the back called the police. I don't remember the sound of the sirens, but I remember the flashing red and blue lights reflecting against the church's stained glass windows. I stood in the freezing November parking lot, my breath pluming in the cold air, wrapped in a strange, heavy numbness. A young detective with a notepad stood in front of me. He asked me questions, his pen hovering over the paper. "How long has this been happening? Do you have the original audio file? Are you safe tonight?" I answered him with perfect clinical detachment. It felt like I was giving a report on a patient who wasn't me. I handed him the thick manila envelope and the flash drive containing my mother's recording. As the police lights swept across the asphalt, a sudden, vivid memory flashed behind my eyes. Sitting in the back of my father's dark truck at 15, holding an ice pack to my ribs, praying for an ambulance that was never allowed to come. Now the authorities were finally here. The paper trail had done its job. The fallout was catastrophic and instantaneous. Within 12 hours, the church stripped Thomas of his deacon title. By Monday morning, his two biggest municipal construction contracts, worth over $300,000, were formally canceled. The town that had protected him for decades abandoned him the very second the truth became an undeniable public record. He was toxic. Because Caleb was 17, a minor, we didn't have to wait for a long, drawn-out trial to get him safe. Backed by my medical records, the police report, and the audio file, Susan filed for an emergency protective order. A county judge granted it immediately. Thomas was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of his wife, his daughter, and his minor son. He was ordered by the court to vacate the house on Elm Creek Drive, which, much to his shock, was half in Susan's name. 2 days later, my father packed a single suitcase while a police officer stood in the hallway, hand resting on his radio. I wasn't there to see it, but Caleb told me later that Thomas didn't say a word. He just walked out the front door, leaving his keys on the ceramic bowl by the entryway. But a monster doesn't lose control without taking one last swing. In a final act of petty, vicious vengeance, Thomas walked into Liberty Fidelity Bank. Because Caleb's college fund was legally in his name, Thomas closed the account. He drained all $42,000 down to zero. He took the money and walked away, perfectly willing to destroy his own son's future just to prove he still had the power to hurt us. When Caleb called to tell me, his voice was hollow. The trap had sprung after all. But Thomas had forgotten one crucial detail. He wasn't the only one who knew how to plan ahead. Grandma Maggie had known the truth for a long time. 6 years earlier, quietly, without telling a single soul, she had opened a $529 education savings account in Caleb's name. Every month, from her modest pension, she had deposited $250. She had $18,000 saved for him. When the Women of Hope Fellowship Church found out what Thomas had done to the bank account, the guilt and horror hit them hard. They had eaten his casseroles and shaken his hand for years. In an effort to make it right, they organized a massive, quiet drive. Within 2 weeks, the community raised another $9,600. Combined with Maggie's secret savings and state financial aid, Caleb had exactly what he needed. The leash was officially broken. Thomas's decision to steal his minor son's money was the final nail in his public coffin. Even his most staunch, stubborn defenders finally saw him for exactly what he was, a tyrant who punished his children for surviving him. A year has passed since that night in the fellowship hall. I am 24 now. Caleb is 18, thriving in his freshman year of engineering school. He still flinches sometimes when a door slams too hard, but his eyes are clear, and he laughs without looking over his shoulder. The house on Elm Creek Drive is quiet, but it's an entirely different kind of quiet. It isn't the breathless, terrifying silence of a family waiting for a blow. It is just peaceful. Susan got her driver's license at 52. She works part-time at a local florist, her hands always smelling of fresh soil and cut stems, instead of lemon polish and fear. We meet for coffee every other week at a diner off the highway. I haven't fully forgiven her. I don't know if I ever will, but we are trying. I've learned that forgiveness isn't a light switch you just flip on. It's physical therapy. It's painful. It's slow, and some days it aches more than the original injury. As for Thomas Vance, He lives in a cheap one-bedroom rental apartment on the far edge of the county line. His construction business is a hollow shell, barely surviving on small private bathroom remodels. He goes to a new church now, but he sits in the back row. He has no title. He has no power. His audience is permanently gone. Sometimes I sit in my apartment and think about what family actually means. I used to think it meant the people in the picture frame. Now I know it's just the people who help you pick up the glass when the frame shatters. If anyone listening to this is sitting in a room right now, holding your breath, listening to heavy footsteps on the stairs, and believing the person who tells you that you are the reason things are broken, you are not. Silence is not loyalty. Leaving is not betrayal. And you never ever owe your image to someone who shattered yours. Stories like this are born from the darkest, quietest places, but bringing them into the light is how we begin to heal. Thank you for walking through this journey with me, and for holding space for the raw, heavy truth. If this resonated with you, if you found a piece of your own resilience in these words, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Let's keep building a community where these deep, unapologetic stories can be told safely. Stay connected, keep your head up, and I will be here waiting for you in the next one.